at a high management level, at some level, there was a certain amount of sigh of relief because management felt like we'd been lucky and we didn't want to push our luck too much. Let's talk about these individually. National will, I think, is the first and most important part of this. The folks that took us to Apollo at a management level and the younger people were people that had history in World War II. They understood that a combination of real solid industrial production and commitment was really important. You know, the generation that went to the moon on Apollo was not only used to succeeding, it understood a commitment to a large long-term goal. The country felt that Apollo had a similar kind of commitment as World War II, and it fired up the nation like nothing before. And certainly nothing in some ways has fired it up since. I think the second key issue of Apollo was money. Apollo had financial resources that we can only dream about in the space program today, or for that matter, most programs. In 1961, at the time of Kennedy's commitment, the NASA budget was just shy of $1 billion, and Apollo received about 10% of that. At the peak of Apollo spending in 1966, the NASA budget was $4.5 billion, and Apollo received just shy of $3 billion. The NASA budget at that time was something like 4% of the federal budget. We receive less than 1% of the budget today. Heavy lift launch vehicles, and particularly the Saturn V, were another key part. The Saturn V remains the largest single launch vehicle successfully flown, either by the United States, the Russians, or any other program. The Saturn V was an incredibly complex 3 million part machine that essentially worked, with one exception, flawlessly through every one of its launches. Without the Saturn V, I don't think it would have been possible to do Apollo by the end of the decade. The other thing that's important about the Saturn V is that to build the Saturn V, we also had to build the infrastructure at the Cape to manage the vehicle, which included the VAB, the crawler, Launch Complex 39, all of the pad hardware, and the launch pad itself. And we still use that. It will be the mainstay of our manned space program for the foreseeable future. I think the fourth key part is landers. The fact is that building the lunar module was totally important in success on Apollo. Without the LEM, we couldn't have done the mission because it would have involved landing great big rockets on the moon, climbing way down to the lunar surface and taking those big rockets off the lunar surface. In any event, deciding to go lunar orbit rendezvous was just the start of the fun, not the end, and the lunar module was probably, prior to the Space Shuttle Orbiter, probably the most complex spacecraft that had ever been built. The lunar module was the first true spacecraft in the sense that it could only operate in a vacuum. It had no thermal protection system, so it couldn't successfully re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. One of the interesting things about the LEM design was because we didn't really know how hard it was going to be to land on the moon, Grumman built into the LEM a considerable thrust margin, probably more than was really justified for a simple flags and footprints mission. Consequently, when we went to later
อะไรมันดูแบบว่ายังเบลอๆอยู่เลยและพ่อกับแม่เองก็ยังคงให้การวกวนอยู่แต่ว่ามีพลเมืองดีมาแจ้งข่าวนะคะบอกว่าเจอผู้ชายคนนึงอ่ะอุ้มเด็กคล้ายน้องต่อขี่มอเตอร์ไซค์มุ่งหน้าไปยังนครปฐมนะคะเนี่ยคือจริงๆแล้วคดีนี้นักข่าวของเราอ่ะทีมข่าวช่อง8น้องเพลงณชาหนองพงอ่ะก็ติดมานะคะหลายวันละรวมเวลาเนี่ย12วันแล้วนะคะเพื่อตามหาน้องต่อค่ะหายตัวไปอย่างปริศนาเหลือเกินไม่พบวี่แววเลยคือเมื่อเช้า
That was so hard to work on that he was unable to successfully complete the EVA. He was beat up physically. His visor was so fogged that he had to use his nose to wipe a spot to see through to get back to the hatch of the spacecraft. The suit was so immobile that his EVA was essentially potentially life-threatening. In 1972, essentially 6.5 years later, Gene Cernan again went EVA, this time on the lunar surface. He did 3 successive EVAs over 3 days and had nary a qualm. He compiled over 21 hours of solid field geology experience on the lunar surface, and he set a record which has not been broken. In less than the 6 years that it took to go from essentially Gemini to the first Apollo mission, The EVA system technology had improved to the point where EVAs became routine, and we're still building and using that EVA capability on space station. The success was a combination of, like all of this, a lot of hard work, good engineering, and a lot of experimentation. By the time we finished with Apollo, we had built over a dozen different spacesuits before we down-selected to what became known as the A7L and the A7LB spacesuits. In addition to that, we built a portable life support system, which was probably one of the most complex small pieces of hardware ever built. It went through 25 EVAs, both in Earth orbit and on the lunar surface, without a single major malfunction. A lot of people whose names we're very familiar with, like Christopher Kraft and Gene Kranz, invented the operations practice that enabled us to go to the moon. They literally made this up as they went. Nobody had ever done this before. If you've seen the movie